Hi, I'm Charlotte Connelly and I'm the Museum Curator of the Polar Museum here at the Scott Polar Research Institute, which is part of the University of Cambridge. And I also wear another hat, which is that I'm chair of the University of Cambridge Museum Steering Group, because we're one of 8 museums and a botanic garden here at the university that covers all sorts of different subjects, from science through to art, through to social history. You name it, there's a really good chance we've got a museum that covers it. So today we're at the Polar Museum. And the Polar Museum is part of the Scott Polar Research Institute, which is home to studies of the Arctic and the Antarctic. And we cover science, we cover humanities, we cover history. And here the collection is really fantastic because it covers a little bit of everything. Now, right now, I'm stood in the Memorial Hall of the Polar Museum, which was built as a custom-built building, so there's lots of really lovely polar features around the place. Because it was custom-built, they could go to town on it. And Captain Scott's widow was Kathleen Scott, who was a really fine artist and moved in some really artistic circles, and her influence was to make sure that there was always plenty of art on display and that artistry was considered in the building of the place. So Sir Herbert Baker was the architect for the building, and in this room we've got 2 really beautiful ceiling murals. So the building dates from 1934, and the ceiling murals are 2 maps, one of the Antarctic and one of the Arctic, and they were painted by MacDonald Gill and Pamela Johnston. Now, the Antarctic one I find really interesting because it dates from 1934, when the building was made, and actually if you look at the map of Antarctica, it doesn't really match what we know today. So the Antarctic Peninsula, where some of the voyages go with Viking, they've not really painted in the detail there. Instead, there's quite a lot of ice covering it because they didn't know at that point whether it was an archipelago or a series of islands, a peninsula, whereas of course today we know that it was a peninsula and still is. There's also not an awful lot of detail in the interior of Antarctica because hardly anyone had been there. So it's a really interesting bit of our history embodied in the building here at the Scott Polar Research Institute. Now, let me invite you to join me to look at some of the objects in our collection. So here in the Polar Museum, the founding collection really relates to Captain Scott, in whose memory we were founded. So a lot of the material comes from Captain Scott's expeditions, including his final expedition, where very sadly he died. And the material in this showcase is taken from the final camp. So when Scott and his colleagues didn't make it back, there was a search party that went out. And they very sadly found the bodies of those men. And they found all sorts of other things as well, which they then brought back. And a lot of it is here on display. So it's things like Bibles. So we've got Captain Scott's Bible here in this drawer. We've even got things like packaging from a biscuit tin that was brought back because it was symbolic of the last food that they were able to eat. So some really, really touching material in our displays here. So for example, we've got some of the correspondence that the men wrote home. This is a letter from Captain Oates to his mother, which was written in January 1912, when he was selected to be one of those men that went all the way to the pole. You might not realise that there was a larger expedition and only a few of them went all the way to the pole, and others stayed back to do science and to support the parties. We've also got letters over on this side. So this is from Captain Scott to Mrs. Bowers, the mother of Lieutenant Bowers, and it's really very touching. He writes, "My dear Mrs. Bowers, I'm afraid that this will reach you after one of the heaviest blows of your life. I write when we are very near the end of our journey, and I am finishing it in company with 2 gallant, noble gentlemen. One of these is your son." So he knew as he was writing that he was explaining to the families and the loved ones about the deaths of their sons and their husbands. And that wasn't all that was found actually at the last camp. When the search parties went out, they discovered the bodies. They discovered that they'd made it all the way to the South Pole. They discovered that Amundsen's team had been there first. But they also found remnants of some of the science that they did. So there were 17.5 kilos of rocks and fossils loaded onto the sledge alongside the tent, and lots of diagrams and notes that were taken along the way. It really was an expedition that was all about science, as well as that march to the pole, and that legacy still lives on here at the Scott Polar Research Institute. So the material in this showcase is all about Captain Scott's Discovery expedition, which took place from 1901 to 04. It was very clearly a scientific expedition. They went on board the Royal Research Ship Discovery, which was a really early custom-made ship specifically for doing scientific research. So just as Octantis has labs on board, so they took scientific equipment on board this expedition as well. And then they set up a hut and a base on Antarctica when they arrived. And a lot of the things that you can see in this showcase really show how self-sufficient you have to be if you're going to do that kind of research. So while it might be all about the research, you also have to be able to survive. So they experimented with different types of cooking material. The things you can see here are sewing kits because they'd have to do all of their own repairs. We've got spare buttons and all sorts. Over in this corner, we've got, it might not look like much, but it's a lamp that was made in Antarctica, and it was used for walking to the field tent to take meteorological readings, weather readings, so that they could log them down. So they were kind of making their own equipment as they went. If there was something that they hadn't taken with them, they'd have to make do with whatever they'd got. And part of being able to do your work, your research, is about making sure that you're well prepared. That means having proper clothing, having proper equipment. And something that they really experimented a lot with was how to protect your eyes. So one of the objects we've got on display here is Captain Scott's goggles. They're a pair of wooden goggles. They've got RFS written across the top. That's how we know they were Captain Scott's. So we've got that kind of item, and we've also got some examples of the clothing that they wore as well. And often it looks really flimsy, but actually if you think about what they were doing, they were hauling sledges around, they were carrying heavy equipment. Didn't take long for them to warm up and maybe get a little bit sweaty. And the last thing you want in Antarctica is to get sweaty, because if your sweat gets cold and it freezes, then you're in real risk of getting hypothermia. So really important that you have the right equipment. So you might be used to seeing museum objects behind glass, like the ones behind me, but if you come to the Polar Museum and you're lucky, then sometimes we have handling objects out. And those are bits of our collection that we're happy for people to touch and feel. So unlike a lot of the parts of the collection where they're unique or rare or very precious things that we wear gloves, we only handle them when absolutely essential, we've got other things that we really want to encourage people to get up close and personal to. So this is one of those objects. Now, maybe you can guess what it is if you've ever heard of a narwhal. So narwhals are a type of whale that live in the Arctic, very high in the Arctic. Very few people ever get to see them. And they're known for having this amazing tusk that grows out of the front of their head. And it's because of this that they're sometimes called the unicorn of the sea. Now, the tusk is actually, it's a tooth that's got a little bit overexcited. They usually grow on the male narwhals, and usually they only have one. Occasionally they grow on female narwhals. Occasionally there's a narwhal that has two tusks, but typically it's one tusk on a male. And scientists are still trying to figure out exactly what they're for, why narwhals have evolved to have these great big tusks out of the front of their faces. And they think probably it's some sort of sense organ. So if I can very carefully hold this up towards the camera, then you can see at the ends that there's a hole. So right there's a hole, and that's where, because it's a tooth, that's where the nerve of the tooth goes through, and you can see it's really thick and it's quite deep as well. So scientists are still trying to work out why on earth a tusk like this evolved, but they think it's probably a very specialized sense organ because it's got this huge nerve that goes up the middle. They think it's really good for measuring pressure, which is useful for knowing how deep in the water you are. And they think it might be also good for detecting salt levels, so how fresh or how salty the water is. And again, that's really useful for navigation or for working out where your nearest fish stocks might be. Now, some of the things I've just talked to you about, the texture of the tusk, it's quite rough because it was abandoned on the coast of Greenland for many years before it was found. The weight of it as well, it weighs a surprising amount. these are really interesting things for our visitors, but of course they wouldn't be able to know any of those things by looking at them just simply behind glass. So that's one of the reasons why we think it's so important to have a few objects that are in our handling collection. Now, this particular tusk, I mentioned it was found on the coast of Greenland. It was collected by a scientist who was working there back in the 1950s, and it eventually made its way to us here at the Polar Museum. And when it was offered to us, we thought, well, we've already got several narwhal tusks in our collection. Possibly we don't really need another one, but wouldn't it be great to have one that people could touch and feel? So that's an example of how something comes into our handling collection. And we get it out when we've got family days and we know we're going to have visitors with lots of young people to the museum. And we also get it out for special sessions with blind and partially sighted people so they can access some of the collections in the museum. And it's always a massive hit when we get it out because it's such an unusual thing to see, and it's so great for people to be able to touch and feel an object as well. So that is our narwhal tusk. So this is a model of a sledge, as you can probably tell, but this one is really nicely loaded up. And we had this model made specifically for handling. So if I just tell you what we've got here, we've got some tent poles along the top. We've got the tent roll itself, the canvas. Over on this side, we've got some rope. Then what else have we got? We've got sledging boxes and canvas bags and other types of roll. And we've got oil canisters, because of course you need fuel if you're going to warm up snow to make water to drink or cook things so that you can eat them. So it's made up to look as if it's a heroic age of Antarctic exploration era sledge. So that age was Captain Scott and Ernest Shackleton, sort of 1910 through to 1920 sort of time period. And this was typically how one of their sledges would look. And we've also got a few other bits and pieces that go with the sledge as well. So a shovel, a pick. So my favourite is this one, and it's a trundle wheel. So they were travelling into places that hadn't been mapped at all. And what you have to do if you're navigating in those kind of regions is use the sun or the stars in order to measure precisely where they are in the sky, compare them with logbooks. There's quite a complicated bit of maths and some complicated observations to do that kind of navigation, to work out your latitude and longitude, precisely where you are on the Earth. So on a day-to-day basis, they wouldn't be stopping every half an hour to do that, but instead they would use dead reckoning. And they would use something like this attached to the sledge. And basically it would count the number of yards for them. We'd probably use meters today, but the number of yards or feet of distance that they were traveling, and on a clicker it would count it. So they would do dead reckoning. They would use a compass to be trying to walk in the same direction consistently and maybe using some of the features on the horizon. They would be using dead reckoning to try and work out how far they'd gone as an approximation. And then only maybe once or twice a day would they stop and do a proper calculation of their location and use that for building up their mapping information. So a really important part of being on a sledge somewhere that has never been explored or mapped before. So that is our model sledge. So our final stop today is the museum's storage facility. So you've got a special behind the scenes look at what we care for, not in the main museum, but down here. And like most museums, only around 10% of our collection is on display at any one time. And there's a whole range of reasons for that. Sometimes it's that an object is just too precious and too delicate to have out on display for long periods of time. Sometimes we might have duplicates that are available for researchers to come and look at. And sometimes it's just that we've got more material than we can physically fit in the museum and we make it available to lend out to other museums for their displays and exhibitions as well. So I'm going to show you a few more of the objects up really nice and close. And it's important that as well as protecting the objects, I protect myself. So I'm going to put a pair of gloves on too. So this is one of my favourite drawers. It contains lots and lots of different types of snow goggle. So the ones we're going to be looking at today are these wooden goggles from the Discovery expedition, but there's also some really lovely ones that were made by Inuit people who live in the Arctic, which actually inspired this design. So they're made of driftwood with really quite narrow slits across the eyes, and they're all made to help protect you from snow blindness. So this is a pair of goggles from the Discovery expedition. The Discovery expedition was to Antarctica from 1901 to 04, and it was led by Captain Scott. And among other things, they were doing loads and loads of really interesting scientific work, but of course, they also had to be able to live there and survive there and look after their health. And goggles are really important if you're in Antarctica. I'm sure if you've been on one of Viking's expedition ships to Antarctica, you've been well equipped for making sure that you're prepared for the cold. And so if you're out in the snow, of course, goggles are really, really important because you really do need to protect your eyes. Now, snow blindness is really unpleasant. It's essentially sunburn, but on the surface of your eyes. So you really don't want to get it. And this particular design was inspired by Inuit, the indigenous people who live in the Arctic, who would often use driftwood that they found on the shore, and they would make a shape like this, and they would cut a slit across it. And that's what they would wear when they were out on the ice to protect their eyes. So you can see that there's a similar idea here. There are crosses cut instead. Now, it turned out that these crosses were a little bit too big. They let in a little bit too much light. And we've got a fantastic collection of goggles here at the Polar Museum, and you can see how they experimented as they went through with different styles and different designs. So we've got some that have got green glass in, or different types of glass, and everyone had their own preference. We've got some where they've got gauze on the side, and then someone's tried to cover the gauze up and then uncover it because they found that if you got any condensation inside and it froze, then you just couldn't see. So there's a really nice story that we can tell about clothing technologies from our collection. But I really like this example because of that link back to the Arctic technology of the Inuit people and how Captain Scott and his men were really inspired by what had been done there by people who'd lived in the Arctic for communities that have lived there for many thousands of years. So it had a lot more practice than Captain Scott and his men had of being in the polar regions. So this is the second of our objects. Just get it out of its box. It's very nicely packed, this one. So this is what I'm looking for. It's a polar medal. So let me just get that out. Now, this medal was posthumously awarded to Edward Adrian Wilson, or Dr. Wilson, who travelled twice with Captain Scott and was really his right-hand man. So he went first on the Discovery expedition from 1901 to 1904, and then he went on the Terra Nova expedition the whole expedition was from 1910 to 1913, but very sadly, Edward Wilson was with Captain Scott when they died in 1912. So Wilson with Scott made 2 attempts on the pole. The first one with the Discovery expedition wasn't successful, but they learned an awful lot about how you might go about it. And then the second one on the Terra Nova expedition, they did make it all the way to the South Pole. They got there and they discovered that the Norwegian explorer, Roald Amundsen, and his team had been there just a few weeks before, which was really a big blow for them, as you can imagine. But on the way home, disaster struck, and they very sadly didn't make it back. And this medal is a polar medal, so the British explorers were awarded with polar medals, and it's got these 2 bars to represent the 2 expeditions that it went on. And actually there's a replica of this on board Octantis, so you can see that if you're on board the ship as well. And they're very lovely, they're personalised, so they've got details on them about who they were awarded to, and on the back there's more polar features as well. Now, Edward Wilson was loved by all. He had a fantastic character. As well as being chief scientist on board the Terra Nova expedition, he was also a really prolific artist and produced hundreds and hundreds of watercolour works. And some of them were purely representational art, just really enjoyed painting what he saw, but some of them had real scientific value as well. So he was particularly interested in birds, so we've got some really beautiful watercolours and pen and ink sketches of the penguins that he observed, and their eggs and the chicks and their development, which is useful for science. Some fantastic drawings of whales as well. And then also, one of the things that they would do while they were there is look at the geological landscapes. So we've got some really beautiful panoramas of some of the landscapes. And in his sketchbooks, you can see the way he's marked them up as being different types of rock and what the geological features are. So it's a real place where art and science combine in the work of Edward Wilson. So a really fantastic person. and very well deserving of the medal, though of course incredibly sad that it was awarded after his death. So my final object then is this lovely thing. And again, there's a replica of this on board Octantis. Now, in a sense, it speaks for itself because it's very clearly a model sledge, but really I want to talk to you about why we might have a model sledge like this in our collection. And it's all about what the Scott Polar Research Institute was founded to do. So I've talked a bit about us being founded as a memorial to Captain Scott and his men. And of course we have our library, we've got researchers based here, we've got the museum. It's a repository for knowledge. But you might not think about the kinds of knowledge that were particularly useful when we were first founded in 1920. So I want you to imagine yourself back to the 1920s and imagine that you were going to go on an expedition to the Antarctic or to the Arctic, and you're thinking, what do I need to take? You might come to the Scott Polar Research Institute to look at our collection of shoes and boots and use them to instruct your bootmaker in what exact kind of design you need in your shoes and your boots so that your feet are well protected. You might come to look at clothing so that you can instruct your clothing manufacturer or the shop that you go to about how you want them trimmed up or how you want them lined. And you might come to figure out what you would need to do in order to take a functioning sledge. So this is an example of the sledge that's in the collection, and really it's here so that people who were going on expeditions could come and have a look and figure out how to get sledges made and built for themselves. And I particularly like this one because it's actually been added to over the years. These, let me just turn it around so you can see the cross pieces at the back were added later for additional stability. But it's a really nice design of sledge. It's called the Nansen sledge after the Norwegian explorer, and it's inspired by Inuit sledge technology. And the way it was put together was that there were no metal bolts anywhere, at least in the original form. So these bonds that you can see, all the places where it's tied, were actually done in rawhide, and that makes it really flexible. So if you ever see any footage of a sledge like these, they really bend and flex as they're going over crevasses and over bumps on the ice, rather than being rigid things that are quite hard to move around with. And they're still used today, actually. So if I just show you what's at the front of this one, there's a kind of a rope that you could use to attach the sledge to a dog team or to a pony team, or if, like Captain Scott, you might find yourself man-hauling. So that's what they were doing 100 years ago. Today, we don't do any of those things, but rather we use skidoos, we use mechanical aids, but the sledge itself has still stayed the same. So it's a really nice piece of technology that continues to be used, and that's why there's a model here at the Scott Polar Research Institute, is because we were the place that you would come to figure out how to go on your Antarctic expedition in the time before mountaineering shops on every high street and the internet where you could look up anything you wanted. Okay, and one last sneaky object. So I've just opened up a drawer that contains one of the objects that we don't typically display, and that's because it's just too delicate. And this is Ernest Shackleton's sledging flag. Now, it's traditional for the men on these expeditions in the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. When they went on a sledging journey, whenever they stopped, they would put up their own personal flag. And they were typically made by sisters or wives or female relatives as a memento. And this one is Shackleton's, and it has 3 golden shackles on it. The reason it's not on display is it's just too delicate. It's very light sensitive, so we can get it out occasionally like this, but usually it's tucked away in a drawer. But also, if you look really close in, you can see that the silk that it's made from is just very old and it's very delicate. So we've actually got some netting, very fine netting, stitched over the top to help to keep it together. But even with that, we can't really display it upright because it would be under too much tension. So we get it out for very special occasions. So it's a real treat that I'm able to show you this. But I thought you might just like to see it. Okay. So it's been a real pleasure to share with you some of the objects here in our collection at the Scott Polar Research Institute. And some of the things that I've shown you today you can see as replicas on board Octantis if you happen to take a voyage. Now, the Polar Museum here is open to the public and is just one more reason for you to visit Cambridge, where there's loads of fantastic stuff for you to see and do. So we hope we'll see you soon. Thank you very much.